How old is young? In the Confessions series, I'm going to go through all of the core reasons I am a young Earth creationist. But before I get into part 2, I want to explain the term young Earth creationist. Specifically, I want to address the fact that I actually reject the word young as being factual. The Earth is not young. It's really old. It's important to understand that young and old are words which are relative to their context. When I pick my daughter up from preschool, I am very old. But when I go to visit my grandmother, I'm actually quite young. It depends on the context, much like short or tall or big or little or fast or slow. So when we call the Earth young, what are we saying? Very simply, we're just referring to our rejection of deep time evolutionary timescales. That word is only a response to the popular dogma of billions of years. But when you actually look at the history of the universe as we propose it, according to the Bible and historians and science, it is far from young as we would ever experience or think of youngness. Take a look at some timescales. This is the past 300 years or so. That big arrow is pointing to the 1776 Declaration of Independence. Since then, 45 men have served as President of the United States. Where were you born on this timeline? If you're under a century old, you were born after the third blue line. If you're still in school, you were probably born after the big white line on the far right side. Included here is every computer ever made, every iPhone, every website, every movie, radio, TV, tank, plane, car, and train. Almost everything we take for granted, from YouTube to the electric light, is found on this timeline, along with the entire history of the United States as a nation. The last century has seen 5 generations of my family be born. As of this writing, my grandmother has seen her son's daughter be born. Think about how many generations have lived across the centuries before in this timeline, and that is only 300 years. This is the past 1,000 years. That arrow is still showing you the birth of America, but now we can see the invention of the eyeglasses, the microscope, the telescope, and the compass. We see the birth of the Protestant church just after the midway point, which means every church other than Catholic and Greek Orthodox fit on the back half of this timeline. We can see the lives of Shakespeare, Genghis Khan, Marco Polo, and all those guys the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are named after. Had America been founded at the start of the millennium, we could easily have already had more than 200 presidents. Where is the entire span of your life on this timeline? Well, how far back can you trace your family? I can trace mine back to the first settlers here on the Mayflower, and that doesn't even go back to the halfway mark at 1500 AD. And this is only 1,000 years. Here is the entire timeline of world history and biblical history. 6,000 years and change. The dark arrow on the far right is still pointing to the birth of America, but now we can see how much has happened before this nation was born. On this timeline is every empire, dynasty, city government, and major work of architecture ever created. Let me make the point. Even according to secular dating methods which assume at the start that the human race as we know it has existed for 100,000 years, all of the known nations, governments, cities, empires, and dynasties exist on this timeline after the first dark arrow on the left. This is a huge amount of history with more events, people, generations, inventions, construction, city songs, and stories than we can possibly imagine. Look at how little of this timeline America takes up. And then try to imagine how little of this timeline your life takes up. Then remember the last time you complained about waiting in line at the DMV. The time it takes to get through the DMV would barely show up at this scale. What I want you to see here are 2 things. One, the biblical model is called the young Earth creation position, but it still involves a huge amount of time. Time enough to account for everything we see on Earth, under the Earth or above it. 2, the only evidence of human civilization that exists shows up after the flood, which is what that big arrow on the right is pointing to. On the evolutionary time frame, this means that the human race did none of those things for 95% of its history, and then, within 1 to 2% of our time on Earth, we founded civilizations, governments, dynasties, nations, and cities all over the world. A fact which is easily explained by the Genesis accounts of the flood and the Tower of Babel event, but it's completely inexplicable on secular models for multiple reasons. So when I use the phrase young Earth creation, just know that I am merely using this name to distinguish my position from the popular billions of years, but the history I am proposing is really very deep and wide. 6,000 years is a long, super long, ridiculously long time. Just keep it in mind next time you're waiting in line at the DMV. All right, let's take a leisurely scroll through that 6,000 years in more detail. Check it out and think about it, won't you? And remember, Jesus loves you.